The water didn't arrive all at once. It came inch by inch, day after day, until entire towns vanished beneath a sea that seemed to have no end. Families climbed onto rooftops carrying only what they could hold. Children cried as their homes disappeared beneath muddy water. Farmers watched years of hard work wash away in hours. Before it was over, one of the greatest natural disasters in American history would leave hundreds dead, nearly 1 million people affected, and forever change the way the United States fought floods. This was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. The disaster began long before the levees failed. During the summer and fall of 1926, unusually heavy rainfall soaked much of the Mississippi River basin. By winter, the ground was already saturated. Rivers and streams could no longer absorb additional water. Then, during the early months of 1927, relentless storms swept across the Midwest and the South. Week after week, rain continued to fall across states stretching from Kansas and Missouri to Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Every drop of rain eventually flowed toward one place: the Mississippi River. As spring approached, the river rose higher than anyone could remember. In community after community, residents gathered along the levees, watching the muddy water creep closer to the top. Engineers inspected the massive earth barriers every day. Volunteers stacked thousands of sandbags. Local officials urged people to stay calm, insisting the levees would hold. But nature was applying pressure unlike anything the system had ever faced. By April 1927, the Mississippi River carried an unimaginable amount of water south toward the Gulf of Mexico. Some tributaries were already overflowing. Smaller levees failed first, flooding farmland and forcing thousands of families from their homes. Entire communities evacuated by wagon, train, and boat. Yet the worst was still ahead. The first major warning came on April 15th, when torrential tile rain drenched the lower Mississippi Valley. In just days, some regions received more rain than they normally saw in an entire month. Water levels surged to record heights. Telegraph messages spread urgent warnings across the South, but many people believed the main levees protecting larger towns would survive. They were wrong. On April 21st, near Mound's Landing, Mississippi, one of the largest levees on the river finally gave way. Witnesses described hearing a thunderous roar before the earthen wall collapsed. Within minutes, a breach hundreds of feet wide unleashed an unstoppable torrent of water across the delta. The force was overwhelming. Millions of gallons rushed through the opening every second, sweeping away homes, barns, livestock, trees, and roads. Entire fields disappeared beneath swirling currents. Families who had gone to sleep believing they were safe woke to water pouring through their doors. Some escaped in small wooden boats. Others climbed into trees and waited for help. Many had nowhere to go. As floodwaters spread across the delta, they transformed the landscape into what survivors called an inland ocean. In some places, the water stretched more than 80 miles wide. Familiar roads vanished beneath muddy currents. Railroad tracks twisted under the pressure. Telephone and telegraph lines collapsed, cutting off communication with entire regions. The flood continued moving south. Town after town disappeared beneath rising water. Greenville, Mississippi, became surrounded. Helena, Arkansas, fought desperately to protect its levees. In Louisiana, communities prepared for what seemed inevitable. Fear spread almost as quickly as the flood itself. More than 27,000 square miles would eventually be underwater, an area larger than the state of West Virginia. Nearly 1 million people were affected, and approximately 637,000 were forced from their homes. It was the largest displacement of Americans caused by a natural disaster in the nation's history up to that time. The human suffering was only beginning. Families loaded whatever they could onto wagons before abandoning everything else. Chickens, horses, and cattle struggled against the rising water. Crops that represented an entire year's income disappeared beneath thick layers of mud. For thousands of farmers, the flood meant financial ruin. One survivor later remembered watching his family's farmhouse slowly collapse into the current. He said the silence afterward was harder to bear than the sound of the rushing water. Rescue operations quickly became overwhelming. The American Red Cross, local sheriffs, volunteers, and the U.S. Coast Guard launched massive rescue missions using boats of every size. Fishermen, river pilots, and ordinary citizens risked their lives pulling stranded families from rooftops. Some rescuers worked for days with almost no sleep. One rescue crew found a mother holding her newborn baby above the floodwaters while standing on the roof of a collapsing house. They reached her just moments before the building gave way. Stories like that unfolded across the Mississippi Valley. As thousands gathered on levees and makeshift refugee camps, food and clean drinking water became scarce. Medical workers worried about outbreaks of disease. Mosquitoes multiplied rapidly in the stagnant water, while contaminated wells left many communities without safe water to drink. Then another challenge emerged. The river was still rising. The water refused to stop. Day after day, the Mississippi continued swallowing everything in its path. Entire counties became isolated islands surrounded by endless brown water. Rescue boats were now the only connection between thousands of stranded families and the outside world. What had begun as a regional emergency was rapidly becoming a national catastrophe. Temporary refugee camps appeared along the highest ground that remained above the floodwaters. Schools, churches, railroad embankments, and levees became home to hundreds of thousands of displaced people. Tents stretched for miles. Families slept on wooden cots with only blankets separating them from the cold nights. Long lines formed each morning for drinking water, bread, and canned food. Medical teams struggled to prevent outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases that often follow massive floods. The American Red Cross organized one of the largest relief efforts the country had ever seen. More than 150,000 people were housed and fed in hundreds of emergency camps. Relief trains carried food, clothing, medicine, and blankets into areas that could still be reached. Steamboats traveled flooded waterways delivering supplies to isolated communities. Thousands of volunteers worked around the clock, knowing every hour could mean the difference between life and death. One rescue pilot later recalled spotting a family waving from the roof of a farmhouse nearly 2 miles from dry land. The parents had tied white bedsheets together to attract attention. Their food had run out 2 days earlier, and they had been drinking rainwater to survive. When rescuers finally reached them, the youngest child was barely able to stand. Another heartbreaking story came from a small farming community where neighbors refused to leave without an elderly couple trapped inside their home. As floodwaters rose, several men used a flat-bottomed boat to break through debris and rescue them just minutes before the house collapsed. Set into the current. Acts of courage like these became common throughout the disaster. Yet not every story ended in survival. Official records confirmed approximately 246 deaths, though many historians believe the true number may have been significantly higher because countless victims in remote areas were never formally recorded. Some drowned when levees collapsed without warning. Others died from exposure, disease, or injuries sustained during evacuation. For many families, loved ones simply disappeared into the floodwaters, never to be found. The destruction reached almost unimaginable levels. More than 27,000 square miles of land remained underwater for weeks. Crops across 7 states were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of livestock perished. Roads, railroads, bridges, and businesses suffered catastrophic damage. Entire local economies collapsed almost overnight. Financial losses were estimated at roughly $400 million in 1927. Adjusted for today's economy, that represents well over $6 billion in direct damages, with some economic estimates placing the broader impact even higher when lost productivity and long-term recovery are considered. At the time, it was the most expensive natural disaster the United States had ever experienced. The flood also exposed deep social inequalities. Many displaced families faced harsh living conditions inside overcrowded relief camps. Access to food, shelter, medical care, and transportation was not always equal. Historians have documented that many African American communities endured especially difficult conditions and unequal treatment during relief efforts. The disaster became a turning point in national conversations about emergency management and civil rights, revealing that recovery depended not only on rebuilding towns, but also on treating every survivor with dignity. As the floodwaters slowly began to recede during the summer of 1927, another enormous challenge emerged. Returning home did not mean returning to normal life. Thick layers of mud covered farmland. Wells were contaminated. Dead livestock littered the countryside. Thousands of homes had either collapsed or were no longer safe to enter. Families who had lost everything now faced the impossible task of rebuilding from nothing. Federal and state officials realized that simply repairing broken levees would not prevent another catastrophe. Engineers launched one of the most ambitious flood control programs in American history. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project expanded and strengthened levees, created floodways designed to divert excess water, and improved spillways and navigation systems throughout the river basin. Many of the flood control structures protecting communities today trace their origins to the lessons learned from 1927. Meteorology and emergency planning also improved. River monitoring became more sophisticated. Communication between weather agencies and local governments expanded. Officials recognized that early warnings, coordinated evacuations, and stronger infrastructure could save thousands of lives during future disasters. But perhaps the greatest lesson came from the resilience of the people themselves. Neighbors rebuilt homes side by side. Farmers replanted fields they feared would never produce crops again. Churches reopened. Schools welcomed children back into classrooms. Communities that had been nearly erased refused to disappear. They proved that while floodwaters can wash away buildings, they cannot wash away determination. If you live near a river or flood-prone area today, preparation remains your greatest defense. Understand evacuation routes before an emergency begins. Never underestimate flood warnings, and never attempt to drive through moving water. Just a few inches of fast-moving floodwater can sweep a vehicle away, and many flood-related deaths still occur because people underestimate the force of rising water. If you enjoy discovering the true STO, rise behind America's greatest disasters, subscribe to American Disaster Files, and leave a like. In our next documentary, we'll uncover another catastrophe that reshaped the nation and reveal the extraordinary courage that emerged from unimaginable tragedy. Nearly a century has passed since the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, but its legacy continues to flow through America's rivers, levees, and emergency planning systems. It transformed engineering, changed federal disaster policy, and reminded an entire nation that nature will always test the limits of human preparation. Because behind every flooded town was a family searching for safety. Behind every rescue boat was someone willing to risk everything for a stranger. And behind every statistic was a life interrupted by a river that refused to stay within its banks. The Great Mississippi Flood was more than a disaster. It was a defining chapter in American history, one that continues to teach us that preparation, resilience, and compassion are often the strongest barriers we can build against the forces of nature.